I'm Dave Potter. I'm with Digital Journal, and we're here at Inventures in Calgary. I'm joined by Shawn Mahoney from Spare Parts and Gasoline. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, thank you.
So just for viewers who may not be familiar, can you tell me a little bit about Spare Parts and Gasoline?
Yeah, Spare Part and Gasoline was founded about 3 years ago, and we're really kind of motivated to help our community change and drive impact for our economy.
And you see, sort of innovation is a big part of what you look at and what you're looking at, and you see a connection between innovation and GDP. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think we often hear the term innovation, but I find it helpful to think about what is it supposed to do. And one of the things I think it's supposed to do is make our life better. And a good measure of that is GDP, because GDP talks about what we can afford. And so things, we think of the obvious things like a car, but healthcare, education are also things that need to be afforded. So I like to think of GDP as a good measure for successful innovation.
And where do you think there's opportunity for Canada or for Calgary? How are we doing today from a GDP perspective?
Well, I think it's interesting. We live in a great city, and we have a very I think a very active entrepreneurial community and innovation community. People talk about it a lot. I think our projected GDP growth in the next year is 1.6, which is leading the national average, which feels good, until you maybe pan out a little bit and you maybe think the average in the U.S. is 2.2. China's even higher. India's even higher, and so I worry that a success in Canada isn't going to be enough to keep us competitive on a global stage.
What do you think the biggest barriers are? What's holding Canada back?
Well, I think there's lots. I think it's hard. I think what we find is all of our country is built on a bunch of systems, and some of those systems maybe just aren't serving us as well as they used to. And I think it can be hard to change some of those systems because they're resistant to change on purpose.
And where do you think there's opportunity? Where do you think we should start if we're looking to change some of those systems?
In my mind, I imagine, there's three things that I think about, or in our work we think about a lot. And I kind of imagine a braid. And a braid, together, these three things braided together make quite a strong rope that I think can actually be the anchor for our economy. And, the first one is fierce startups. And I think it's changing the dialogue on startups a little bit to say it's not about how many we create, but the type we create. And I think we want our founders of these to be real people who are really bold and ambitious. They're fire starters. And we need to give them the gasoline to increase their impact and to make them more competitive globally. I think the second strand of the braid is change-ready enterprise. And, we're lucky to be in a city like Calgary where, we have a lot of good industry here. They've supported our lifestyles for a long time. And, they would be very difficult to replace. And so it's really important that we find ways to help them adapt and change and thrive in this rapidly changing world. And the last, and probably the one that kind of hits me in the heart the most is humans. And we need to actually help people navigate these changing way work is so they can actually work with purpose and at their full potential.
And so just going back to the idea of the fierce startups, How do you define a fierce startup as opposed to a regular startup?
Well, I think the fierceness is about our ability to compete. I don't think startups are easy. And I think a fierce startup is kind of bold, stands up, and is striving for big change. And I think we aren't always ambitious enough, and we're not always bold enough in the way we approach startups. And this is the challenge to me. Like as a founder of a startup, I kind of have to look myself in the mirror and say, am I doing theater here, or am I actually really trying to make a change that's going to actually help something like the GDP? And when I move my lens up to that level, I start to think about maybe talking and connecting, working with people in different ways. And I think that's kind of the call for us as startups, to really own that place and really try to be the best in the world.
And what do you think, where's the opportunity for government or other organizations to help enable the fierce startups or to help the threads?
That's a tricky one, right? And I guess it's a bit like a parent. If you protect your kids from all the hard things in life, they don't get the experience or the knowledge that's so critical for them to be resilient and adaptive. And I think that's a tricky thing to balance. And so, I think there's probably some desire to want to help a lot, but I think some of it is just, trusting that they're going to get the job done and kind of encouraging them when it's difficult. But I don't necessarily think it's more funding.
Yeah. And there's a lot of innovative people here at Inventures. What would be your call to action to them?
Again, I think it's, let's look in our eyes, look ourselves in the eyes and say, how are we actually affecting GDP? How are we doing something that we can measure that's making a difference? It's easy to talk about the cool thing that I did or the story I wrote. But really, I think we just got to settle into these are tough times, and we need to actually look and say, are we making a difference for our broader community in a real impactful way?
And how do you look at measuring that impact? I mean, GDP is a big number. It's hard for the leader of a startup or even a medium-sized organization to tie their actions to GDP, I think. Unless, how do you make that connection? Well,
but I think we look at we have service offerings for different organizations, but we measure value. We measure the value we create. We measure the jobs that we actually help create in the people we work with. I think it's thinking in those terms, and because if more people have jobs, well, then that is actually affecting GDP. And if people have jobs, then we can afford some of the other more important social challenges we actually have to solve for, like housing, healthcare, so forth.
And do you think a lot of leaders are just too busy with the day-to-day to make that connection these days?
I think it's difficult to see the system, and I think it's true. Like, I think there's, what do they say, urgency versus impact. I think we are faced all the time with very urgent problems that sometimes it's difficult to see the system and the broader things that we need to do.
So if you had one sort of key message to startups in Calgary or in Canada more broadly, what would that be?
I think it's really lean into being bold and fierce and, really push yourself to actually compete at a global level and think about it that way. Winning Calgary is not big enough, and really strive for the biggest ambition you can imagine.
And when sort of the challenges that come with that in terms of it's hard to set your sights very big, but then still make the day-to-day choices to keep things moving forward. How do you look at structuring those things? How do you approach that?
Well, I start with thinking about time. And the first thing I think about is, do I have time to do something mediocre? Like, I have a finite life. I have one Halley's Comet cycle to go through, and how am I going to use that time? And if I'm not trying to do something really big and impactful, if I don't really push for that, what have I settled for? And what does that mean for my kids and the generations that follow on behind me? And so I think taking the time to kind of reflect, like just to have that thought, changes how you behave.
I don't know if you're familiar with Rutger Bergman. He's a Danish historian. He just published another book called Moral Ambition. And he has a similar idea, but his spin is different. He's less concerned about GDP, but instead saying all the smart people that are busy trying to make money, we should take that innovative spirit, that intelligence, and put it towards making big change in the big problems that the world has. How do you think that resonates with what you're talking about? Do you think it's aligned, or is it in competition?
I think it's yes. I think the answer is always yes, because I think both things can be true. I think he's not wrong. I think what happens when people don't have the necessities, they have trouble doing the higher level functions. And so I think one of the things is I'd like to be able to afford the space and time for people to solve the big problems. And that's why I picked GDP. But he's right. We are going to have very many things to solve if we want to preserve our way of life.
One sort of final question. If you're talking to an organization or talking to a startup founder, what's the one thing you'd tell them to do tomorrow if they're trying to go down this path?
Commit. Commit to a big thing. And I saw a thing once. I think it was a tattoo on a military person, but it was be okay that total failure is okay. So maybe it's success or total failure, and take that. And then if you have total failure, learn, try again. Right.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
For more on innovation, check out digitaljournal.com.